I want to explore one of the most important human equations that I'm aware of through the lens of two stories. And both of these stories have happened many times, and as part of the, counter movement towards addressing a shadow-averse culture, I'm going to delve into our cult shadow. So the first story is a 6-year-old girl who is molested incestuously by a wealthy, politically connected father. And I was actually reading about this in Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. And in her early teen years, after years of sexual violation and incest by her father, she goes public. And the mother backs up the father, and the father uses the wealth and the political connections to threaten not only the daughter, but the surrounding political power system. That unless the daughter agrees to lie and recant the story, that he's going to forcibly put his daughter away in an institution, classify her as insane, and thus cover the shadow of his abuse. And the daughter seeks an outside psychologist, and they confirm that there's no basis for institutionalizing her. And the therapist also believes her. And in this story, you could say there's a happy ending in that the therapist advises her to recant the story on condition, because her father was going to withdraw funding for education, seek to institutionalize her, and also throw her out of the family home. And so you have a principle illustrated between, the tension between mass and intelligence. And intelligence, statistically speaking, is always in a minority. And mass is always in the majority. Mass refers to the influence of power. So the daughter agrees to recant the story on condition that her therapy, where she's allowed by the therapist to tell the truth, continues. And she can complete school. But understanding that her father's loyalty is to a reality in which some of the most important events of her life do not exist. And her loyalty is to becoming an integrated human being. You cannot grow and integrate when you are insane. And you are insane when you are asked or forced to believe that key important events in your life didn't happen, or that certain feelings don't have a right to exist, etc. So once she had graduated high school, rather than carry on with college under this contract of silence, she left home, negotiated a reduced therapeutic cost with her therapist, because now her wealthy father was not going to pay for the therapy if she was telling the truth about his incest. And she started continuing her own life now as an independent person with enough, I guess, development and now legal authority that she could be her own person and, of course, forfeit the right to her father's support. But let's look at the many cases that go the other way, where a 6-year-old girl, an 8-year-old girl blurts out the obvious abuse to the family. And the more abusive the abuser, the less anyone in the family system wants to stand up, because in an abusive family dynamic, it's usually it's not a matter of is there going to be an abuse. The question is who is going to take the brunt of the abuse. And siblings usually collude to pass the buck, to scapegoat the individual who's least able to defend themselves. So this could be the youngest. It could be, in a chauvinistic culture, the youngest girl. This could be someone who doesn't fit in because we like to attack anomalies and diversity neurologically and physiologically and socially. Anyone who doesn't quite fit in with the majority is an easy target to scapegoat. If you've got a group of Republicans and one Democrat, and there's the question who's going to take the hit, why not give it to the Democrat, or vice versa? And so the girl gets institutionalized. And in an institutionalized setting, where every time the girl tries to speak the truth, it is validation for the reason that she's insane and validation for institutionalizing her further. So when you punish someone for telling the truth first by putting them into an institution, and there was actually an interesting study conducted to, I guess, ascertain how effective insane asylums were at determining sane people from insane people. And in order to do this study, 2 totally competent psychological research students, prime of life, highly intelligent, getting their degrees, falsified their way into an insane asylum. That was their one deception. But then they behaved completely normally, like they would have otherwise, including obvious pointing out that they were not insane, and observed that the degree to which they advocated for their sanity, for their intelligence, and that they should be released was to the degree that they were viewed as high-risk insane inmates and were given extra restraint, extra, higher security, more medication, with the view that, that their advocation for their health and sanity was the most clear indication that they were in no condition to even, be considered for being released from the institution. And so once, our young woman who was put in the institution for telling the truth to the family system tells the truth to those in the asylum, she gets elevated to a higher risk and understands that the only way to survive, to have any sense of security or hope of dignity, is to lie and is to manipulate, or to give up in complete despair, because the system is using mass to dominate intelligence. And in the equation of mass and intelligence, mass always wins. Mass always wins because intelligence, or the bleeding edge of intelligence in any bell curve of intelligence, is always occupied by a minority. Meaning, if you take the most intelligent people, by definition, they are the smallest minority, because there is a bell curve on just about anything, including intelligence, and the majority are always average. And so you have the most idiotic individuals, the most uninformed, dogmatic, and lacking comprehension at the rear end of the bell curve. And then you have the bleeding edge. Now, if you're in a left brain, abstract culture like our own, then the geniuses, or the highly intelligent people, are the people who can do mathematics, who are good at articulating, etc. If you had another bell curve of intelligence, emphasizing the feminine, or right brain and emotional centers, then, the bleeding edge might be the most sensitive and empathic people, with then the average for the majority, and at the tail end of the bell curve, you would have, people that are so unconscious and don't have a clue. They don't know what they're feeling, and if they do, they don't know what those feelings mean. They confuse hate with love and this and that, and so it's, you'd have, a very low level of emotional intelligence. So in this story, the question is, what is the probability, if we take 1,000 6-year-old girls and molest them for 4 years with a family system that sides with the abuser, what's the statistical probability field, with a highly influential, wealthy father, that this girl is going to be severely psychologically and physically abused and demonstrate traumatic symptoms? Well, they're quite high. Shame is a trauma, because it's a phenomena of exclusion. And in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, love and belonging is level 3. And love and belonging is the capstone on survival and security. One of the interesting things about the hierarchy of human needs developed by Abraham Maslow is that you have the hierarchy. Everyone starts with survival, and everyone then moves to seeking security about that survival. And then there's the seeking of love and belonging. But in a cult such as our own, with an interdependent economy, when just about everything we touch has ripple effects out into the cult, if you do not have love and belonging as defined by other people around you who consider your pain, your need, or your pleasure as valuable as their own. See, for example, in a family where you have a sense of belonging, if you raise a hand at dinner table and say, I've got a stomachache, your need for the stomachache balances with Dad's need to pontificate or have a sense of order and rightness, or Mom's need to, who knows, or the other family member's needs. And so you're excused to go and rest. And the fact that everyone modulated, everyone attuned in some way to your need, communicates that you belong. Similarly, if you have bleeding feet because your shoes are worn out, and your brother is getting brand new sneakers every 6 months because he's the boy, in an environment where you belong, when the girl raises her hand and says, my feet are sticking through my shoes, if she belongs in that family and is loved in that family, then the brother, who has lots of brand new sneakers, will go with less sneakers, and she will get a pair of good shoes. If she does not belong, meaning that her needs are automatically deranked relative to others, or all of the children's needs are automatically deranked relative to the parents, then the law of empathy diminishes and the law of mass increases. The law of mass is about domination and is about sociopathic use of mass so that the strongest person, the biggest person, the person with the most money, the person with the most fame, whatever it is, has their needs met first. In tyrannical dictatorships, the people are used for the benefit of the dictator. In abusive dictatorship dynamics, the people's needs come secondary to the dictator, so any dissident is murdered and executed, and any person who can be used to gratify the needs or preferences or whims of the dictators is given conditional support or tolerance to the extent that they are useful. And whether this is the hierarchy in a gang, the hierarchy in a company, in a capitalist company, the CEO in most capitalist companies have their needs as the highest, and someone that can help the CEO make a lot of money will be given a cushy job. And the people who are not, directly correlated to meeting the needs of the CEO are discarded or minimized or treated as badly as they possibly can be and still get the job done. Where, if you can lower wages or export the jobs that were done in a town to another country, then if that saves a few pennies and allows the CEO to kick in a nice stock option bonus point if the share price hits a certain point, where they can get maybe $100 million set of incentives for bringing the stock to a certain point, then it's only the people that are directly contributing the most to that who are treated well, and everyone else is treated sociopathically, meaning as much, just enough to keep them around so that the company doesn't collapse. And so this is the framework of sociopathic utilization of mass, otherwise known as abuse of power. And no one feels that they are loved or that they belong. Or often what happens is you have high-level people in a company or in a family system who cover the reputation and protect the boss or the head of the family or the whatever group it is, as long as they're being treated well. But as soon as they are cast out because they're no longer useful, then you have a diminishment. They're discarded because they are no longer useful for the peak of the power structure, which for many centuries, if not thousands of years, has been men, wealthy, famous, powerful men up at the top. Now, with the women's movement, it can be highly strategic, highly masculine, wealthy, typically white women at the top. But it's the relationship between those that have less power or rank with those who have more power. Now, if we do our statistical study of 1,000 young women who are first given the message that they don't matter, and within the disbursement of shame, there's always a message behind the behavior. So the problem in the message of a man 3 times the size, 4 times the weight of his 6-year-old daughter is that his needs to be sexually gratified on demand are more important than the needs of his daughter. In such a discrepancy of scale, for example, there will always be a lot of pain. But that doesn't matter. So the message is you don't matter. You're not valuable. And in environments where a bigger force is dominating a smaller force, there's always protest, like, this doesn't feel good. Daddy, stop. This doesn't feel good to me. So the second message is that your well-being is not as important as my well-being, because I'm willing to hurt you. I'm willing to terrify you. I'm willing to confuse and overwhelm you. That doesn't matter, because you don't belong. My pleasure, my gratification, that's okay. It's so much more valuable than you and yours, is the underlying message. So it's a message of worthlessness. It's a message of valuelessness, because incest in that type of dynamic is guaranteed to have a significant negative impact on the child for the rest of their life. Now, that negative impact begins immediately. But it's also saying that your future is so unimportant, your future health, your future sanity, your future ability to relate to other people. Incest survivors who have been repeatedly violated, for example, do not trust other human beings for good reason. Their context says that there's going to be a time, if you're close to someone, where they have the power. If you go hiking up the mountain with someone, when you're not looking, there's a point they could knock you over the head and rape you. There is going to be a point in every relationship where the other person has leverage. And when the template of the masculine to the feminine is one of abuse and violation of that leverage, when empathy doesn't apply, when the reptilian sociopathic brain says, I'm going to prey on the most weak and the most vulnerable, what you learn is that you're surrounded by reptiles. And if you are surrounded by reptiles, you can't sleep. You've got to watch the reptiles. You can't calm down. You've got to watch the reptiles. And you can't count on the other reptiles to back you up, because you have less to offer them than the dominant person in power. You're less of a threat as a 6-year-old girl than your 200-pound father. So you're less of a threat and you have less to offer. You see, if you challenge a wealthy father and stick up for the 6-year-old little girl, he can and will punish you in a sociopathic cult. Meaning, if he's buying his cars from your dealership and you see the scream and a little bit of blood, and you see the terror in that 6-year-old little girl, you lose the sale if you turn your attention to the little girl and say, "Little girl, what's wrong? How can I help?" The father says, "That's it," and goes to another dealership that's willing to play along with the silence. The school that the little girl is in. Maybe often if there's a situation of wealth and power involved, often the secrecy is bought implicitly with large donations. Now, when you are in an environment in which you are not loved and you do not belong, meaning there is not a single person in your circle who will put your pain and your pleasure and your needs at the same level as everyone else's, you do not belong, but you also have a survival disadvantage, meaning the adverse child experience study is in, and whether it's a 5,000% increase in the likelihood of suicide, or whether it's increased medical bills, or increased risk of mental emotional disease, or lower likelihood to rise in rank in your company, or less friendships. Because when you've learned that you're surrounded by reptiles, because the reptilian brain or the sociopathic brain was the predominant mode of interaction by your father, when you learned that people can't be trusted, you can't make friendships. So you're more isolated and you're more vulnerable to re-abuse. So the question is, what's the equation? What is the probability field of getting hundreds upon hundreds of messages that you don't belong, that you're not loved, that your survival and security is thus in jeopardy by your caregivers in a dependent state? What is the outcome? And what we have here is a statistical probability field. And then we have human uniqueness. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, survived the Nazi concentration camps and found meaning in the process of doing so. I believe he is quoted as saying that you can survive any what if you have a powerful enough why for going through it. Contrary to the sociopathic abuse dynamics in many families, for example, young men are known to take the beatings directed at their mothers themselves. And so dad's still a 200-pound sociopath who's even more enraged that someone had the audacity to stand up to his power. But the son has a why. He willingly inserts himself between the father and the mother so that she will not be hurt. And with that why, and in an either-or paradigm, in a sociopathic cult, where the culture has abandoned the protection of the family. You see, because our cult may or may not respond to issues of domestic violence, but it does a terrible job of preventing revenge killings, as just one example, or stalking, or financial punishment. So it's not that the police won't arrive, but in a sociopathic cult, the neighbors will gossip and traditionally shame and humiliate all the children in school because they're tainted. They've been infected by the cult's abuse virus. And in a shadow-averse cult, once you're tainted, as his daddy rapes his sister, children that are raised in an abuse cult, in a scarcity mentality, that are made to feel significant, that are emotionally illiterate, that are relationally illiterate, that are getting zero help for their own traumas, look for a scapegoat. In the abuse cycle, violence moves down. The father abuse, there's the classic standard, stereotype in military families. The father abuses the mother abuses the older child abuses the smaller child, and the child kicks the dog. The anomaly, the shameful one, in a cult that cannot own its shadow, we do something rather cowardly. We blame the victim of the cult's cruelty and stupidity. So it takes a pretty dumb and a pretty sociopathic and cruel, as well as ignorant cult, to have the amount of sustained physical, sexual, and emotional violence over hundreds of years as we have in our households, and decide, I know how to fix it. Let's make sure that the children do not receive a single hour of traumatic literacy on how to recognize traumatic symptoms and repair them. That'll screw them up. Let's make sure that the most emotional children, the people that haven't been numbed out right off the bat from the abuse, are targeted for bullying rather than elevated as teachers who can teach the other students emotional literacy. So in a cult of this nature that scapegoats its victims rather than advocate and protect them, sure, the police might show up setting all the siblings up for teasing, bullying, and humiliating for the next 4 years. Bravo, police. The police may barge in and terrify the children with flashing lights and all that, and zero competency in violence de-escalation. Bravo. They may throw the father in jail and jeopardize the finances. Good job, police. And in generally can be counted on to make things worse, but are certainly unpredictable. You see, no 8-year-old is given a list of what will and won't happen if they call the police. So we have the terror of the unknown, and then we have the terror of the known. The beating is known. Calling the police, an unknown. The more traumatized you are, the more frightened you are of the unknown, the more comfortable the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. So statistically speaking, we're going to have a child with massive amounts of shame, self-esteem issues, physical damage to her body, and a clear expectation that she will be used and that her only value is to be used by higher authorities. That if anyone has any interest in her whatsoever, it must be because she can be used for their benefit. And the sickest aspect in the psychological abuse is the reframing of the shaming and abuse as love. So now you've really fucked up the child. You've given them no emotional literacy, no traumatic literacy, no abuse literacy, and no experience of a single grown-up standing up for her. And then you go out, and then you've got dad saying that this is because he loves her so much. You're my special child. But if you tell anyone, I'll kill your dog. The most sane body in the house, meaning a traumatized child that cannot trust a single human being, is going to gratefully hold on to a dog that in our cult is more likely to give secure love and belonging than a human being. Why do so many of us who have been abused withdraw and isolate from the dating pool or the abuse cycle and gratefully embrace relationships with cats and dogs that don't hit us, that don't shame us, that don't rape us, and that do not withdraw affection erratically whenever we say something that is taboo? And in a shame-based, shadow-averse abuse cult, what's taboo is always pointing out the abuse. That's hypocritical. You shout at me every time I do something wrong, but you do more things wrong than me. And then you get angry when I even point it out. Okay, we're in an abusive dynamic. So what does the abuser do when confronted with the obvious fact? Assuming they're mildly sane, but they don't like piecing the puzzle together, what they do is withdraw love and affection. Okay, that's it. You're nagging me. I'm not going to fix your car. Fix it yourself. Do this. So there's an immediate punishment, a withdrawal of love and affection that's only extended if we can live in the insane world where the abuser is perfect and loving and everyone else is ruining their lives. That was the message in my family. I never once heard either parent say, "That's it. We've ruined your lives. What were we thinking not wearing a condom? What were we thinking? I chose, this abusive man and he chose this. What were we thinking? We are fucking up our lives and we're fucking up your lives. We are sorry." Now, in a shame-based cult, it goes the other way around. The only person who wasn't around to decide whether mom and dad wore a condom, who didn't pick the other person as spouse, who didn't decide to get married, and certainly didn't decide to live in a dysfunctional, emotionally illiterate household for their early childhood years, is bombarded with the message, "Your father did this. I thought he was your husband. You're ruining our lives. Wear a condom." It's no fun to be born into an abuse cult. Don't blame us for your stupidity. But this cannot be said. That gives a good whack. Or, if the parent has to hang on to a righteous sense of superiority, like they're not petty, of course not, then they have to seek revenge in a more circuitous route. And of course, every child knows when this is going on, but the parent has the added satisfaction of playing righteous while being incredibly petty and childlike. No, you're not going to play soccer with your friends today. You're going to study this and clean the garage and stuff because I want you to become a disciplined, healthy person. Yeah, you want that every time I've pointed out one of your many stupidities and you're trying to seek revenge without looking petty. We all know the game, but the game cannot be named because that gets further punishment. And in the law of mass, the grown-up, the school, the government, the gang, the social group, the bullies, whatever it is, in the law of mass, they always win. And we see this no matter what sphere there is. The only, in this tension between intelligence and mass, the only time intelligence wins is if the intelligence being advocated for. So all intelligence migrates from a minority to a majority. So, for example, when Sigmund Freud was taking Charcot's research and trying to understand the core origins of trauma, what he discovered was a staggering amount of sadistic sexual abuse towards young girls in these upper class, kind of well-cultured families. And he was so excited because he'd found the pattern for this underlying trauma, which at the time was being called hysteria. Words change, the phenomena don't. And so he had found the pattern. In a deep partnership with women, coming across a correlation between trauma and sexual abuse. And he published his very well done scientific paper and waited for the applause. But the people reviewing his paper were upper class men who sexually abused their daughters, who sexually abused women. They did not want the truth coming out. And over a period of time, Freud talked about, in his diary, the complete and utter isolation, the withdrawal of survival, security, love, and belonging. This is the dictation or the dictate or dictatorship of mass. When the masses do not like your message, it doesn't matter if it's true, doesn't matter if it's not true. When the masses have an agenda that is more important than the truth, making them look good, not feeling guilty, whatever it is, the masses withdraw love and belonging. You see, and if no one's buying Freud's books, it's withdrawing survival and security as well. If no one will publish the papers, if no one invites him to dinner, if no one will refer clients to a psychologist, his self-esteem, love and belonging, security, and survival are all cut off overnight. And Freud endured this only so long before he understood that a correction was needed. If he was going to survive and be secure and have a sense of love and belonging and self-esteem in a sociopathic abuse cult in which certain truths could not be named, then he needed to change sides. If you can't beat them, join them. In a sociopathic environment with the reptilian brain, this is the only way to go. So Freud pivoted away from the glowing validation of women to his current predominant theory, which is that all women desire to be masochistically abused, that if they really were abused, there was some part of them wanting it, and that most of this was just fantasy, that these abuses didn't go on, but if they did, that women wanted to be raped at some level, and he developed the complicated mathematic backdrop to explain why this was the case. Now suddenly all the upper class men who were reviewing this paper pivoted. This is the best paper we've ever seen. A new breakthrough in psychology. This is wonderful. I knew my daughter was asking for it. And so we pivot, and suddenly Freud is the preeminent psychologist of his day, making massive amounts of money with an endless amount of referrals, survival and security, being invited to all the dinner tables where he could talk about the perverse nature of female sexuality and the superior nature of men. And, of course, high self-esteem, as he's written about and touted widely. But in order to do that, he had to turn on his feminine patients. And most of them were willing, with the law of mass, with no longer having an advocate, rather than being harassed constantly. Most of the women were somewhat suggestible to saying, well, that didn't really happen. That was a fantasy. It's in your imagination. But then there was this one woman, Dora, who said, fuck you. I am not going to go insane to buy into your new theory. And so she left Freud's care at that point to protect her own sanity. And it's always a minority that will do this. She left Freud's care at this point and then went into her own development and developed her own science, which was taboo as well. A mere woman thinking she actually understood things. And so she began to develop her own theories. She began advocating, for women in various ways. And the Freudians hated her with a passion because she was the anomalous data. Most of the other women were, oh, thank you so much, Mr. Freud, for enlightening me. All the memories I had, they didn't happen. I really wanted to be raped. We have to study why, the perverse nature of my sexuality, blah, blah, blah. Good thing the men of the day are around to rescue me. Thank you for explaining this all. Now my husband isn't as guilty, so he's not as upset at me. So he treats me a little bit better, but with a patronizing air, and peace is restored, and we can all move on. So if Sigmund Freud can be frozen out into pivoting in reverse after doing some of the most brilliant research today, where his original paper lines up identical with the findings and results of less biased men and women. I mean, how much has changed in 100 years? We can actually have female scientists, etc. And of course, with the feminist movement and that push, there is a need to hear things from the female lens. And so we have, Freud's original work being comparable to the best work being done today. It was just silenced for 100 years because when love and belonging is withdrawn, survival and security is very low. And we know this biologically. As mammals, if we are in a pack, a monkey pack, if we're in a pack and there are various monkeys at the perimeter, when a predator enters the field, there's going to be someone in the pack that alerts all the others in the pack. And so you have a dynamic where your survival goes up because you're part of a group where you belong. Now, if everyone hates you, as in the case of Dora, because she's not going along with the party line, that she's a fucked up psychopath who likes to be raped and just has fantasies, but she's actually telling the truth, then she's going to be the last one invited to the party, which means she has less career opportunities, less self-esteem, less healthy integrating skills. When you're isolated, your social skills deteriorate because you're not socializing, which then becomes the cause for not socializing. In a pathological culture, first you abuse someone, and then when they show symptoms of the abuse, you reject them for demonstrating the symptoms of the abuse. Because in a shadow-averse culture, where we all like to be noble and right, if you think of it in the very broadest sense, there have been 10,000 cults in human history, 10,000 cultures, and every single one of them believes or believed that they were right. We're part of an insane, sociopathic, chauvinistic abuse cult. And we're the greatest cult that's ever been. Every cult in human history is the greatest cult that's ever been. Anyone that's normal would put a plate in your mouth. Anyone who's normal would genitally mutilate young girls at puberty, to become a woman. Anyone who's normal would cut off the tip of the male penis at birth without consent. It's just the thing to do. We all know what's normal. And we all know that we're right. And we're right because we're right. And that's why we're right. It's self-referential. There's no analysis. No one goes around the globe and says, who gets the very best return on a healthcare dollar? statistically over time, and that culture is the very best at this, and every other culture is idiots. No, other cultures just do exactly what they've been doing, for decades and continue. When I went to England as a 10-year-old boy, we lived in a 400-year-old house, and my bedroom had a key that was this long. The key was this long, very easy to pick, of course, and it looked like kind of a castle at the end. It was 10 times heavier, 10 times louder, 10 times bigger than any key I'd ever seen in my life as an American. And they were selling these locks brand new at the local hardware stores because they had been selling them for hundreds of years. And I thought, none of the locksmiths flew across the water in the last 40 years and noticed that there's a cheaper, easier, safer, lighter, smaller, easier lock system? Never occurs? It never occurs to a cult to go outside of itself and actually measure everything that it's doing relative to intelligence. Now, cults measure what they're doing based on whether it was like the way they did them before. We cut off male penises because we've been doing it before. I mean, you couldn't propose cutting off bits of the labia as a standard practice these days and get away with it. Why? It's like, who came up? We haven't been doing this for hundreds of years. Why do it now? But male penis, go ahead. Let's let's balance out the world. You over here on this part of the world can mutilate women. We'll mutilate the men, and we've got it covered in one country or another. Now, 98% of the girls and women going through a shame-based abuse cult of this nature will show statistical degradation in well-being in a variety of metrics. That is a certainty. And so here we get into an interesting tension, which is between the point, or the masculine, or the individual. There's a lot of in a polar, in a dualistic paradigm, you break the circle down into halves. And so we do a lot of this. So one of the interesting dynamics is the point and the circle, the individual and the group. Now, when I was in Thailand, I was stunned to see a Thai woman kite surfing on, at one of the schools. And I was stunned because almost no one in Thailand, particularly women, know how to swim. And if they do know how to swim, almost none of them like to swim. And if they like to swim, no one in all my visits to Thailand and months of kite surfing, I'd never seen a Thai woman kite surf. This is an anomaly. It's a cult anomaly. If I'd been kite surfing in Maui or the San Francisco Bay, I would have seen numbers of women. Not as many as men, but still, this would not have been worth mentioning. But the only Thai woman to kite surf, what's going on? And so I approached her. And because here's an anomaly. It's a cult anomaly. It's not a physiological anomaly. It's not like German women are better at kite surfing than Thai women. No. And I said, why are you kite surfing? What I was fishing for is what's different about you. She said, good day, mate. I like the water. Of course I'm kite surfing. And I said, I said, but you look Thai. She said, yeah, I was born in Thailand, but I was raised from the age of 2 in Australia in an Australian family. I said, what do you think about the fact that everyone in Australia around the beach can swim and none of the Thai women can swim? She said, they're all wimps. Those Thai women, I don't get them. I don't, I like to be outgoing, So what this points to is the fact that we are far less of an isolated individual than we are a point that mirrors the circle in which we were raised. So you have a chicken and egg dynamic. The circle creates the individual, and the individual becomes part of the circle. And so it goes, and so it goes. And so the circle is feminine. It's the group. The individual is masculine, and some cults emphasize the circle. In Native American cultures, you would not be considered a leader if you told anyone what to do. You would immediately lose your leadership. A leader didn't tell someone what to do. A leader listened to what everyone else wanted to do and did such a good job of holding space that the group slowly came into cohesion. So you have a feminine power structure where the group has the power and the leader is a space holder. Space, the feminine counterpoint to the point. Listening, the feminine counterpoint to speaking. The group, the feminine counterpoint to the individual. Now you contrast that with an American cult where the leader is by definition the person who tells other people what to do, who makes the tough decisions, and other people have to carry out the orders whether they like them or not. The Captain Kirk. So you have two different paradigms. Every cult has been right. You could not go anywhere. If you go over to the tribe that's genitally mutilating young women, they will tell you your women are not women. You fools. You missed the golden opportunity to genitally mutilate your women. Send uncircumcised boys over to America. Why isn't your penis cut off? It's the same thing. Cults are self-referential. And what differs is there's a number of metrics on cults, and we won't go into all of that, but what differs is some cultures are highly traumatized and are very dogmatic, extreme, and self-referential. And other, more healthy and abundant cults are more diverse and more tolerant of diversity, less dogmatic, and also tolerate more individual expression, more anomaly. And every cult has its, variance that changes by generation as to what is and is not okay. A mohawk might be tolerable in the 80s, but it's a little bit passé. So even within a cult, there are these waves of memes. And if you're not in there with the majority, cutting your hair short as a woman when that's the modern thing to do, well, then you're out of the cult. Or if you're not there, being a progressive feminist when progressive feminism is part of the wave, then you're out of the cult. You're with us or you're against us. And the cost is when you lose love and belonging, you also lose survival and security. And this leverage of mass, intention with intelligence, intention with the individual, is always one with mass. Where intelligence wins is by slowly converting individuals over time until the new technology, the new meme, the new idea is adopted by the majority. Then it has the mass to consume the outdated idea. So butter was great for a while, then came margarine. Well, who wants to eat vegetable oils? But after enough advertising and this and that, the other, sure, it doesn't taste as good, but everyone's telling you it's healthier. So much healthier than whole milk butter. So everyone starts taking margarine. But then, the dairy industry isn't going to be left out, so new studies are done, etc. And then, whole milk, organic butter and this and that is much better for the brain and better fats and stuff, and get rid of margarine, and off it goes. But everything has an adoption bell curve that begins with the small, and if it's to grow rather than be bullied out of existence, it has to convince others. It doesn't have to be correct. Margarine doesn't have to be better than butter in order to convince everyone that they should eat margarine. It just has to be the in thing to do to where you're uncool. You're uncool if you're a boy and not skateboarding. You'd much rather play the piano. It doesn't matter. There's no massive bell curve of young boys playing the piano. Do you want to be weird? No, get a skateboard and do what boys are supposed to do. So you have mass, you have intelligence. And the other thing you have is grace and violence. But let's get into that bit a little bit more indirectly. So let's say 980 or so of our molested women who have been shamed and institutionalized and then attacked for advocating for their sanity, and then further given diagnosis. We've got a DSM manual that lists 5,000 separate diagnoses for mental emotional disorder. And so as soon as the incest survivor in the insane solution says, "You're not believing me, you son of a bitch," well, now they've got combative defiant disorder, meaning they're angry that they're not being listened to, so we've got a disorder for that. And if they're sometimes very quiet and depressed because they realize that no matter what they do, they can't get out, and sometimes they're beating their head against the wall and saying, fuck you, let me out. Well, now you've got split personality disorder. Look at them. See, they're depressed over there. And then after about 3 days of giving up in despair and recovering from their exhaustion, they get up and they start pounding the door. They're multiple personalities, and so look at it. There's that one, then there's the one in the middle where they're trying to manipulate. They're trying everything they possibly can to survive, to feel secure, to, part of that, gain freedom, to have some sense of love and belonging. How can you be loved and feel like you belong when you are categorized by being mentally, emotionally deficient by the very fact that you have been imprisoned in a mental institution? How can you feel like you love and belong when every single person that listens to you on the staff, you see this huge gap? When you say something, it's evidence of your insanity. And when the staff member, colleague, says the same thing, it's evidence of their intelligence. You don't have any love and belonging. You don't have rank. The age-long rant of women. You don't have rank. So what we're talking about here are statistics, statistical impact, and statistical outcome. That is an actuality field, meaning 1 in 7 Americans are substance addicts. 1 in 3 Americans in a domestic relationship participate in some form of domestic violence. 1 in 3. I mean, these are the statistics. And if you look at the way the circle creates the one and the one creates the circle, you can see the pattern. For example, I went through $140,000 in therapy. This is a stigma, by the way, in a cult that is shadow averse. If you seek help to fix your cult's ills, you're stigmatized, not the cult. The cult doesn't say to itself, wow, people are basically decent, healthy, good individuals. What did we have to do to all these people to get them so fucked up that they needed therapy? Cults don't do this if they're shadow averse, because shadow averse shame cults seek to scapegoat and stigmatize the individual for the problems of the cult. Scientifically, it's a wash. Does the alcoholic mother who rages at her son's sensitivity, who is married to a father who refuses to talk about a single feeling, who goes to a school where anyone who talks about sensitive feelings are bullied, and watches the news and TV where comics ruthlessly throw darts at every sensitive feeling and poke fun at them. When that boy shuts off all awareness of his sensitive feelings so as not to be humiliated, not to be shamed, not to be treated with contempt by his mother, his father, his school, and the media, let alone his high school peers, you can now diagnose the boy as being numb or sociopathic, or you can just call him normal. Or you can diagnose the cult. You can say this is a normal, healthy boy who's seeking survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem, the first four in the hierarchy of every human being's needs in human history. And in order to meet these needs, he is adapting away from a healthy self to shut down emotions and underdevelop emotional communications, and is simultaneously being trained to participate in the sarcastic chauvinism towards femininity and emotions in himself and in others. And he is rewarded for doing that. So we have a very healthy and intelligent boy in a very sick and perverted system that statistically lets very few healthy boys grow up and be balanced in their clutches. But the DSM manual of 5,000 mental emotional diseases does not list a single diagnosis for the cult. So you see the chauvinism at work, because in a chicken and egg dynamic where the people, that boy who is ruthlessly trained in chauvinism is, of course, going to grow up, become a father, and going to expect his son not to be intelligent, not to be emotionally balanced. He's going to expect his son to fit into the same template that he was asked to fit in, because we don't do cultural analysis. We don't reference every one of our memes towards well-being. We don't do a scientific study, for example, where we're going to have 100,000 Americans teach their boys to be emotionally literate, and then see if those are happier than the other few hundred million that are pathologically taught to deny their feelings. We don't do those studies. Why would we? We already know we're number one because we're number one, because we were number one before. And it feels good to say we're number one, than that we're a bunch of morons who can't even apply basic science to examine the most significant memes in our culture relative to well-being or relative to other countries and do something about it. I mean, that's pretty lame, isn't it? They have a 400% higher quality of life in Denmark. And with our whole economy of scale, we can't pull off the same thing? It's too much. It's pretty dumb. But cults are dumb. They're not intelligent. They're held together by the law of mass, not the law of intelligence. And they quickly stomp out. I mean, this is way too long, isn't it? Normal people don't talk about these things for a whole hour. Maybe a little tweet. Let's just not watch the video. Why on earth would we be so abnormal to learn useful things about ourselves and future generations and our species when we could be studying cat whiskers on YouTube? Why would we do something so abnormal? So that's all you need in a traumatized cult, because the more traumatized the history of a cult, the more fear of the unknown there is, and the greater the attachment is to the norms that aren't intelligent, but that protect us from our fear of the unknown. It may not be intelligent to spend more money, more metal, carry around a huge, enormous key for a lock in England, but it's making everyone comfortable. They're not going to say, what's this newfangled lock? I haven't seen this before. It was good enough for my father. Why isn't it good enough here? They're not going to have to deal with the unknown. It looks exactly like it's looked for hundreds of years. And so in this dance between the point and the circle, America is a chauvinistic cult towards the masculine, so it focuses on not only masculine traits, but the individual. Individual freedom. How are you individually free to have an empathic relationship with people who are emotionally illiterate as part of the cult? How are you free to have your traumas that are almost institutionalized into the cult? How are you free to have your traumas treated with sensitivity and empathy in a traumatically illiterate cult, in which you can go from cradle to grave without a single hour of scientific traumatic awareness? As I say, I went to age 40 and $140,000 of years, or $140,000, before a stranger in a cafe told me more about trauma than I'd learned in $140,000 of therapy with multiple practitioners, or anywhere in my entire life. What a wake-up call. So you have this tension of the point and the individual. Now, the feminine, or the group, or the circle, or the cult, has the mass. The individual has the intelligence. So whenever you have a tension between an individual and a group, the group always wins. But statistically speaking, the group is always less intelligent than a small minority within the group in a given domain. I'm not talking better than, less than. I'm just saying if you take 1,000 random people, the person who knows aerodynamics the most may be one individual who knows more than the whole rest of the group combined. Or it may be 3. So then we're dealing with, less than 1% of the people are the most intelligent in that arena. But everyone knows what the norm is. And that's why we have, the reference to the madness of crowds. Intelligence is always in danger when you have a riled up crowd in fear. And that's unsettled with the unknown. The job of the crowd is to murder the individuals who upset the norms. The Chinese, under Mao's leadership, executed all of the intellectuals. So now everyone was the same. No anomalous people, no bothersome teachers or anything that actually knew anything. We don't like some of these ideas, and so let's just kill off the minorities. This is also why you can correlate the growth and future prospects of any cult or culture by how well the majority treats and honors and learns from the minority. Because the minority will be more intelligent than the majority in every single arena, every single time. Another very interesting thing along those same lines that Nassim Taleb researched in The Black Swan was that only a highly competent person in a given arena can tell who is and who is not highly competent. Meaning the incompetent therapists do not know they're incompetent because they don't have the competency to tell whether they're competent or not. Only an excellent therapist knows who is and is not an excellent therapist. Only a terrific communicator or a great public speaker knows who is and isn't a great public speaker and why. You're great except for your ums. You're good except you're, this and that and the other. And so we've looked at the equation of mass, which correlates with the circle, which correlates with actual statistics equations, which determine. For example, there weren't many Viktor Frankls coming out of Auschwitz, but there was one. So you have this anomaly, and you have this tension where in a lot of statistical science, you can predict the crowd, but you cannot predict the individual. Meaning there is no science alive today that could say, okay, we are going to incinerate 6 million people and torment them every step of the way. And there's going to be one Viktor Frankl who comes out. Now we're going to do a survey and we're going to find out who is the Viktor Frankl. No one can predict who is the Viktor Frankl, which is why you can tell what the crowd is going to do, but you cannot tell which individuals in the crowd will be the anomaly. And here you have the paradox of choice and certainty. The paradox is that if you mix butter, milk, eggs, salt, and baking powder in a ratio that's a little bit soupy but not too runny, and put it on a hot pan with oil, and after it browns, flip it over and let it brown again on the other side, you will get a pancake every single time. That's the statistics. That's certainty. That's science. Cause and effect. But unlike the pancake, individuals are anomalous. And so you have the paradox of free will and statistical certainty. And we, of course, do very little to educate one another about the difference between these two. Some people, head off to Vegas and really hope they're going to be the one person in 100 that places 100 bets and comes out of there with more money than they went in with. If you place 100 bets in an environment where the odds are stacked against you, you will lose 99% of the time or more. But there's the odd white crow. There's the Viktor Frankl. There's the anomalous individual who goes to Vegas with $100 and comes out of there with $1 million. It's not 1 in 100, maybe 1 in 10,000, but there is that individual. And we can't predict who that's going to be. And yet we all have the sense of agency. We all have the sense of freedom in our lives. We all know that we have some degree of choice. And not every girl who's been institutionalized and incestuously raped and humiliated by the staff and maybe raped again, many of our institutionalized individuals are sexually and traumatically abused repeatedly in the institutions that we put them in order to recover from. We take tens of thousands if not hundreds of thousands of dollars per person to reenact the abuse at an institutional level that was happening just fine at home. And yet there are women who went through all of that and came out the other side and are amazing human beings. And that's really what I want to explore in this video. How do I, as a sexual abuse survivor, break the odds to come out of sustained violence, shame, insanity, and a message that you don't matter, and find the self that I was or could have been before the innocence, before the beauty, before the truth, before the goodness in my probability field was extinguished by a statistic of such overwhelming mass and impact that statistically is going to implode and crush my life. How do I break free from the tailspin of a shadow-averse cult? You see, the tailspin works like this. You're abused as a child, so you develop some form of complex PTSD. In a cult that is traumatically illiterate, with a DSM manual that is incoherent and absurd according to many of the best psychologists, you're not going to find a way out, but you will be shamed and stigmatized with a label. The culture doesn't have traumatic stupidity syndrome. You have ADHD. The culture doesn't have violence and shaming of children syndrome. You are defiant, you're angry and defiant, so you've got anger-defiant disorder. So we're going to scapegoat the individual. So you've been abused at home, and so you have some symptoms of the abuse. So then you are stigmatized as part of the scapegoating protocol of blame the smallest part in the continuum, because the people who have the power are the parents. And the obvious thing to do with the amount of traumatic disorders in our cult would be to shed light on the profound sociopathic incompetence of many parents. Be an obvious place to look. But you see, in the law of mass, if it's a private school, the parents will take the kid out of school if any teacher gives them any idea. If the principal notices that every time one of the teachers tells one of their own students, what your mom and dad is doing to you is against the data, they're abusing you, and then that child goes home and says, my teacher says that you're abusing me, a narcissistic, abusive parent doesn't say, thank you for telling me, I'm so glad I can change my ways. A narcissistic parent calls up the principal in an outrage, because they're a narcissist, it's all about them. How dare a teacher stick up for my child? I have the right to do this, and this is normal, healthy parenting, certainly normal. And so the principal tells the teacher, cut it. Don't defend the student, protect the abuser. I don't want to deal with it. And so you have this horrendous sociopathic equation, which says that if you have three people, a victim, a perpetrator, and a bystander, the bystander has to decide who to side with. kind of hard to be neutral in a rape. And the bystander has a proposition from the victim that says, endanger your life, be courageous, go into the unknown, do something you've got no training to do, and help me with no reward. Because I'm 6 years old, I'm not going to pay you. Because I'm a minority woman, I don't have money for attorney bills or whatever it is. With the racial inequality and the financial inequality that come from those abuse statistics. Let's just move on from slavery with no reparations. Why should we repair hundreds of years of pathological sociopathic abuse? We took off the chains, didn't we? Now get on with it. Why would we repair the abuse? It doesn't make any sense. You don't have the power. We're the big ones. We've got the majority. You're lucky we took these off at all. Now get on with it and don't disturb us. So in an abuse, dynamic like that, if the witness says, I'm taking a stand for the victim, they get no reward, and there's a cost and there's a risk. A sociopath doesn't really like that proposal. So then you go over to the perpetrator. What's their deal? The perpetrator just says, pretend this didn't happen. Don't give evidence in court. Say you weren't there, and you can be on your way. Oh my goodness. Quite a deal, isn't it, for the witness? And so in a sociopathic or fear-based system, and particularly when people don't get training, in an abuse cult, if you were kind, you would, of course, train every teenager on how to rescue other people safely from trauma and abuse. It's going to happen, so why not rescue the victim? Why should we? What would we get out of it? We're in a reptilian sociopathic state. Who cares about the weak ones? And from the reptilian perspective, anyone who gets hurt, anyone who is tricked, anyone who is weak, is lower rank than the perpetrator. From the reptilian brain perspective, the perpetrator is the winner, and the victim is the loser. And from a reptilian power organizing principle, you ally yourself with the biggest perpetrator. People that, for example, don't like to feel helpless. Many boys terrified and humiliated and made to feel helpless with their fathers when they were 5 years old grow up to be police. Because in the government, what they learn is nobody takes care of you when you're weak. So what you want to do to survive is you want to be at the top of the dominance hierarchy. Well, that's a military, that's a president, that's a police, and then you've got the power. Then you'll never feel helpless again. Because your cult is sociopathic, so your answer is not to rely on other people. Your answer is to become the biggest dog in town. This answers every 5-year-old's pleading scream. Please, I never want to feel that helpless, that hurt, that lonely again. Okay? What do you have to do in an abuse cult? Climb the power tree. So what is going on with this equation with the Viktor Frankl, with the lovely, forgiving woman who was tormented her entire life, with the sadistically abused boy who actually grows up to have compassion? What's going on with this split with the statistics? Why do a certain number of people a year walk away with $1 million when the odds are stacked so heavily against them? Why do a few of our cult citizens stay sane after bombarded with the nonsense of our dogmas? how do a few people get out of Azkaban? And that's really kind of what I want to look at here. Because the first thing to understand is that no system is closed. No system is closed. Every system is alive, which means there's energy entering the system and there's energy exiting the system. And this is one of the first arenas of freedom. So one of the variables in whether something scars you for life or not is how invested were you in the equation. Now here's what I mean. Investors know that diversification is a very important, if not the central important thing in a long, successful investing career. If you talk to Ray Dalio or Warren Buffett or any of the top investors over time, diversification and risk management through diversification is the way to stay in the game. The number one rule is have money to put in the game another day. Now, in the cult dynamic, you see this same diversification or kind of lack of diversification in residency. So, for example, if you travel around the world, like I spend a lot of time in an apartment I have in Thailand, when things get really hot and traumatic in the US, and I can't fix the equation that's stacked against me, I can pick up and leave and find myself in another environment that is 300% more conducive to my well-being. Meaning the first day that I spent in Thailand many years ago, I analyzed why I was 300% happier than I had ever been in any place in the United States. And those variables are constant. They're environmental. One of the things is smiling occurs 500% more. Another reason is 300% less impatience, more patience. Another thing is 500% more attuned to feelings. So these are statistical cult memes within the Thai cult that are in many areas diametrically opposed to the cultural continuums of the US. So, for example, a cultural continuum would be time. And in the United States, new and improved is Trump's tradition. In Thailand, tradition trumps new and improved. So you see the reversal. So that's a cultural continuum. So mental orientation, emotional and social orientation, another continuum. And Thailand and the US are the opposite. This isn't an accident. I hunted the planet for the most opposite place to the United States on sociopathic and chauvinistic continuums. So I was looking for a more feminine place that was less sociopathic. And there's some splitting and distinctions that add to the complexity, because there are many profoundly cruel aspects of Thai culture. But as I experience it as a foreigner, a Farang, with money, the amount of empathy and room for my feminine side goes up 1,000%. And so I'm 3 times happier. So I can pick up and head over there. If I have that freedom, the fact that I'm a Sigmund Freud in the United States where 0 people are agreeing and supporting this position or this position doesn't have as much weight as it does if I'm stuck here, being bombarded with shame and exclusion every single day. And so this is the principle of diversity. And it influences how much mass any given relationship has. If you've got 20 decent friends and one friend decides to betray you, lie to you, steal from you, and whatever, you've still got 19. if you've got one friend, and many Americans do not even have that, meaning many Americans do not have a single person in their life, this is the statistics in the abuse cult, that they can tell everything to without shame, that they feel love and belonging, meaning that there's a single other person that would value their pain, their pleasure, and their need as much as their own. That's peak belonging. Many Americans do not have a single person. I do not have a single person in the United States that values my pain, my need, and my pleasure as much as their own. Not even close. In some situations, it gets to be about a 3-to-1 ratio. Meaning, if someone can say that, okay, I'm willing to experience 1 unit of pain or discomfort or awkwardness so that Dane can experience 3 times less. But a 50-50, no, I'm not going to defer. If it's 1 unit of Dane's pain and 1 unit of my pain, let him have the pain. I'll do what I want and, fuck him. I'm an individual. My rights count. That's the nature of a chauvinistically oriented cult, it's all about the individual, not about the group. By contrast, strangers in Thailand do give me a tremendous amount of empathy in that realm. So I feel like I belong more in a foreign country than I do my own, because the people there let me know with their tone, their behavior, and their words that my pain is as valuable to them as their own, that my joy is as valuable to them as their own, and vice versa. And so we're dealing with a lot of love and belonging, a lot of empathy on that metric. So if I can escape the tailspin, because we began talking about the tailspin, the abused child gets stigmatized at school with a learning disability, and then feels some shame around that, and also has a harder time trusting people, so they don't make as many friends, so they're more isolated, which adds to the shame, which reduces confidence. Going out with shame and few contacts into the world, their business prospects are much lower, which means the lack of love and belonging is going to increase psychological pain, and there's going to be less money to offset that pain. And then if they go to therapy, it's a new stigma, and they have to spend more money when they have less. So you can see the downward spiral. And then if they have less, maybe they give up a vacation or something so they can pay for therapy. So now their body is suffering more. They're driving in traffic to see their therapist in high stress. And it's often a big question in our cult whether the total off, stress around money, traffic, feeling shamed, the incompetence of the therapist is such that you actually get a net return on investment. Some studies say there's no return, meaning statistically speaking, you're not going to be any better whether you're in therapy or not. Again, it comes back to a distinction between good therapists and bad therapists, which neither us nor the bad therapists have the competency to evaluate. And you have a majority in an emotionally illiterate, psychologically illiterate cult of bad decision-making and bad therapists relative to a minority. And of course, the minority of very good people in a field like this are generally overbooked and not in your city or whatever. And so there's a tension around that. So the first question is, are you captive? Here's the way to look at it. Let's say you have $1,000, and that's you. And you put $10 into Bitcoin, and Bitcoin goes to zero. Well, there's less of you. And you put, X into this, and it goes up, and there's more of you. The equation of investing yourself in a relationship with an organization, an individual, or a cult is set by the probability field. So you enter a sexual relationship with someone you don't know very well in America. What are the odds it's going to end well? Quite low. If you defined ending well being a mutually respectful long-term friendship, very, very dismally low. But can you work with those odds? That's if you follow the normal protocol. So every relationship has a script that could be called the equation. The swipe left is one script. Swipe right, swipe left. That's a script. That's how you determine how you're going to connect. Another script would be you would meet the parents of the person you want to meet and evaluate their relationship and assume that in an emotionally illiterate culture, the children are going to copy, because nobody's going to teach them to think differently, the parental template. And so you could say, well, if they've got a 40-year healthy, loving marriage, marrying into that family is a good idea. So these are scripts, and every script has a probability field. And the math of the script determines the probability field. So why does one person get crushed with heartbreak and trauma and betrayal and all that, and another not? One is how much of you was invested in the relationship. So if you put all your money into a stock that crashed, you're wiped out. And that money doesn't come back. You're more depressed, you're more anxious, you feel ashamed, because we rank people based on how much money they have, and we also rank people on how independent they are, which is how much money they have, and we rank people by how confident they feel, which ties into how much money they have. So if you lose all your money, your shame goes up, your independence goes down, your confidence goes down, and your need goes up. Every single one of these deranks you. Even the banks, if you really need a loan, they won't give it to you. If you don't need a loan, they'll loan you as much as you want. And so you've got a dynamic where if you put all your money into this and it goes south, you lose all that. Now, if you're in an algorithm where people choose friends and lovers based on how confident and how wealthy they are, now your survival and security doesn't just go down, your love and belonging disappears. Without survival, security, and love and belonging, you have no self-esteem, because that's not who you aspire to be. A self-esteem is earned love by being who you want to be, so you collapse. And this is where you can tell whether you're in an empathic or a sociopathic cult. In an empathic cult, the more you need, the more you are given. In a sociopathic cult, the more you need, the more is withdrawn and punished. And so, the little girl who isn't raped by her father doesn't need someone to listen to her. She feels okay and she's got a good dad. The incest survivor desperately needs someone to listen to her. But the teacher avoids her of all students because the teacher is terrified of being fired when the principal takes the side of the narcissistic, abusive parent. And so because little Jenny tells the teacher she's sexually abused, the teacher will not look at her and make eye contact because he's too ashamed of his own cowardice. Because she doesn't want to admit or see the cruelty of her self-centeredness. That the teacher is saying that, like your dad, I think my cushy life is more important than protecting you in a helpless and vulnerable state. And if you give a little girl that message over and over again, she will have zero basis for self-worth. And we do it systematically. Don't ask, don't tell is what it's called. It's called being normal. So if we invest more of our energy into an equation, then the outcome is more more significant. If that's a stock that loses money, if that's a relationship that loses money, it hurts us more and more. So that's part of whether you can go through a trauma in something and come out the other end or just be wiped out by it. The degree of identity with the witness versus the identity with the part that's in the circle, that's in the equation. What I suggest is that every interaction is an equation that is a mathematical probability field that can be measured by statistics. And so if you identify, I am the one who was raped, I am a rape survivor. Now, this is very easy to do because when you are traumatized by rape, you feel dissociated and terrified. You feel in unknown terrain. And so you look around for something solid. And sadly, the most solid identity to grab to is I am the one who was raped. So now I am the one who is worthless because no one valued me enough to prevent the rape, to prepare me for the rape, to repair the damage of the rape, to compensate me for the rape, to persecute my abuser, or to understand my feelings. That's a lot of abuse for someone who has the misfortune of being among 20 to 30% of people who experience sexual abuse. So how much is in the identity of the equation? 2 plus 2 plus 3, you've got 7. Am I 7? Or am I the one that put some of myself into this equation? Am I the one who experimented on this relationship and said, well, we'll give it a shot? I'm the one who said, I'll put 10% of myself into it, and we'll see what happens. I'm not the 10%. I'm the one who invested the 10% of my heart, of my feelings, etc. And I'm the one who experiences the pain and the shame of that disappointment. I'm not the pain and the disappointment. So there's a distinction between the identity with the equation and the identity with the part that witnesses the equation. This is really, really key, and it's what Buddhism generally works on. The equation itself, of course, is one of the single biggest things. If you love your friend, and your best friend is out to get rich, and they're looking at their options, right? So we've got buy a house, invest in commodities, or go to Las Vegas. 3 options, right? If you love your friend, you look at the statistics, okay? 80% of all people who invest in real estate over the long run make money. 80% of all people who invest in commodities futures lose money. 99% of all people who go to Vegas lose money. So if you care about someone and their survival and well-being, what's your advice? It doesn't matter the person. It doesn't matter the region. It doesn't matter the house. The equation with the highest probability is real estate. The highest probability for what? For generating security and survival. Because now you have a house, you can't be thrown out by a dysfunctional landlord and traumatized by that. So you've got more certainty plus an 80% odds of making money. The equation is the single most important thing. You have to pick good equations. But we don't even learn how to think this way. And we do not educate many of our students with statistics. We educate them with dogmas. Go to college. Maybe that made sense when you got back from the military in the 50s. But most of the smartest people say it's a bad investment to run up $100,000 or $200,000 of debt that you can't get out of for a degree that is not guaranteed to create enough income to offset that debt versus to just go out and start a business or something like that. But you also need to know the statistics around restaurants. I mean, if you start a restaurant, 70% of them fail. 70% of small businesses fail within a short number of years. So, what do you advocate for you as your best friend or for a friend as your best friend? The statistics of the equation are the single most important thing in the decision how much of yourself, how much of your energy, how much of your money do you put into a probability field. For example, my therapist, Peter Sandhill, escalated a sexual relationship while I was high on my first psychedelic experience after pushing me to overdose, charging me for money, and then, doing a complicated abuse pattern after that point. The statistical odds of an American male having their first homosexual experience with a therapist and paying for it under the influence of psychedelics is about 1,000 to 1. Meaning, if professional therapists go around sexually abusing their clients by the thousands, there is going to be the odd one who comes out better over time. There's going to be a white crow. But if you are decent and kind, you will never send your child into an abuse environment that has 1,000 to 1 odds that it is going to do significant harm. That's just not intelligent. It may be normal, but it's not intelligent. So how much of you is in the equation? And, I talked about the important thing is in the back of my mind in this is, how do I break the odds? When 1,000 people, or 999 out of 1,000 sexually abused therapeutic patients, are going to have lifetime scarring from that dynamic. And when psychedelics escalates, one of the things that psychedelics do is they take down your ability to regulate how much you invest into that moment. So MDMA, my therapist suggested a high dose of psilocybin against my protests, meaning I argued with him and he kept pushing. And then while I was high on my first psilocybin experience, he then prescribed and recommended MDMA for my first thing, and then escalated a sexual relationship within that container. Well, these two drugs, opening the mind and decreasing critical thinking, MDMA removes fear. Now, this is a terrific thing to occur when you have a safe, trusted human being who knows what they're doing. It is an absolute act of cruelty to reduce your fear when you're with a narcissistic sociopath who doesn't know what they don't know and has no interest in finding out if it makes them look bad. If you reduce all your critical thinking in that environment, you're going to have a tremendous amount of identity because it's going to be the most intense experience of your life. So it's the equivalent of investing, say, 90% of your savings into Enron. It's devastating because the equation is set. Of course, we don't teach our students or anything, never do this because the odds are 999 to 1. We just avoid our cult shadow because we for some reason we feel more comfortable pretending that these grave threats in our cult don't exist than we do preparing to prevent them and respond. Doesn't make any sense. It's one of those tensions where everyone does it, and so a small minority of intelligent people say that doesn't make any sense and do it differently, but the greatest number are idiots in this domain. We do not educate ourselves on the most relevant statistics for our well-being. That means we're not doing our job competently as a cult. Every cult should justify its existence on every metric relative to data if you want to have a healthy, evolving cult. Otherwise, you have the cult dogmatic aspect of every cult just doing the norm. So the equation is the most important thing. So the most important thing that I needed to know that I didn't know, because I was conscious, I just had no fear and resistance to having a romantic relationship with my therapist. Feels great when you're on MDMA. I was conscious, this is why it's a date rape drug. I was conscious, but I had no data and I had no fear. So a tremendous amount of me was induced by the trust of an incompetent therapist into one of the most abusive experiences of my life. So because it's so intense, and then the other thing was my girlfriend had just kind of expressed her trauma to and I didn't know what trauma was at the time, as I say, a stranger in a cafe. A girlfriend had, been expressing her trauma abusively to me, and I didn't know how to deal with it because we're traumatically illiterate, and I just knew she was hurting me regularly, and so I had to say goodbye because it was hurting too much. So then I'm isolated, so I'm dependent on my abuser to figure out why I'm in so much pain without knowledge, and he's calling it love. And so how sane you are, how much data you have, determines how it's like if you have the instrumentation to say that you're in a nosedive, then you can get out of it as soon as you know that. But if you have instrumentation that tells you you're growing, because that was the paradigm, that was the intention. You don't pay someone $175 an hour to fuck up your life. You pay because you believe it's going to help you grow. Now, if your therapist, the person you've trusted, says, this is good, you're growing, but you're actually nosediving and you don't know it, it's very hard not to hit bottom and to pull out within a paradigm that defines success as a nosedive. It's very likely you're going to hit ground. So you have the equation, you have the intensity, you have, do I identify it? I identified, because it was the strongest experience of my adult life, I identified with the part of me in the equation more than I identified with the part of me that was before the equation. Because you see yourself in a new way. And then the decision you have to make is, which one do I identify with? Am I this person who's had this experience, or am I this experience who has this memory? That is a huge pivot point. And because feeling high on MDMA feels fabulous, and that's what I wanted to feel, I identified with the part in the equation that was in a nosedive. And so it was very difficult. The past has weight, meaning if you've been raped 3 times and someone starts to rape you, it has more impact than if you've been treated really well your whole life and you're just like, why is this person being so obnoxious? It's not a question of me being valueless. It's a matter of them being absurd. This isn't a question of my value. I know I'm valuable because I've been treated valuably since birth. And this segments into persona and identity. What I mean by that is my feminine side has been treated like shit from birth. My masculine side has been treated very well indeed. So I have zero doubts about my value as a moneymaker, as an articulator, as an author, whatever. No question. But the psychedelic experience was costing money, not making money. Had nothing to do with these parts. The psychedelic experience was about reopening the feminine self that had been shut down with chauvinism. And that part of me has been treated so consistently, shamefully, and undervalued that I have no past reference to how to advocate and treat that part of me well. So when my therapist treats me worse than almost any lover in my life, and then asks me to pay for it, that is a huge message of, I don't care about you. I'm willing to risk your life, put you at 1,000, 1 to 1,000 odds of anything good happening out of this, and I'm going to charge you a lot of money, and I don't want to hear if you don't like it. You're not worth it. And that resonates with 10,000 cult messages saying you're not worth it, you're not worth it, your feminine side doesn't matter. That wound goes in because there's no template for defending that. No one taught me how to defend my feminine side. Now, of course, I would have defended if someone had smashed my car. We're all chauvinistically materialistic. But who gives a damn about a car compared to a broken psyche, compared to a fractured heart? Apparently no one. And so the past repeating itself in that.